Hi everyone, so I'm going to talk about war photographer. I've got a new phone with better memory, so should hopefully be able to get it all in one video. War photographer is written by Duffy, who is a woman, and the poem is about the character of a photographer. We assume it's influenced by a friendship with a war photographer because she was really intrigued by the job. So we can assume that's what influences the character in this poem. But the character in this poem is a war photographer. The war photographer is not the poet herself. So it's written by a woman, but it's about a male war photographer. So I asked you to look at some key quotations in the lessons for this week. I've done annotations, as you can see, because I know some people might find it useful to have typed up annotations and to read through them and put them in their own words, but I also know for a lot of people it's sometimes easier to have them explained in a bit more detail, so that's why I'm doing a video as well. So the quotation is, "With spools of suffering set out in ordered rows." So spools, this is a picture of a spool, is a film reel, so it suggests that there's loads of images of tragedy. So that's a really good quotation for highlighting the tragic and brutal effects of a conflict. If the war photographer can get enough images that multiple spools are filled with film of a camera, then it's really drawn attention to the fact that there's so much tragedy in these conflict zones. So Caroline Duffy, through this, is able to highlight the brutal effects of conflict on a place and to highlight the amount of tragedy and suffering that is endured in places that are affected by conflict. Then there's set out in ordered rows. And I think what's really interesting that is really focusing, he's setting out all these images in an order, and it could reflect how his sort of motivation for doing the role is that he, the war photographer, potentially thinks that by taking these photos he'll be able to play a role in bringing some order to the world, and hopefully helping the chaos and conflict affected zones. The next quotation is one of my favourites: "Belfast, Beirut, Phnom Penh, all flesh is grass." So Caroline Duffy mentions these conflict zones. These are real places and they've really been affected by conflict. I'd recommend researching them. We've looked at Belfast a little bit already, but just Google Beirut, Google Phnom Penh, and you'll see, if you put it into Google Images, you'll see photographs of conflict. I think it's a really clever thing for Caroline Duffy to do because it highlights that whilst it's a poem and whilst the war photographer character is fictional, these conflicts are very, very real. So she's just highlighting that the things addressed and described in the poem are very realistic and they are very much going on around the world by mentioning these real conflict zones. She then uses a biblical reference, "All flesh is grass." We should know this because we're at a Catholic school. And all flesh is grass means human life is temporary. And I think it's really interesting to use after Belfast, Beirut and Phnom Penh because nowhere in the world is human life more temporary than places affected by conflict. Children die in these places. So she's almost highlighting that human life does not last in a conflict zone. Of course, human life is temporary anyways, we're all going to die, but hopefully when we're old, in these places, it's like life doesn't last very long. These aren't places for life to exist, such is the horror of the conflicts that are happening there. So human life, we get the impression, doesn't last very long in these places, which is horrifically tragic. Human life is cut short in these places because of the conflict. So another really good quotation for highlighting the brutal effect of conflict on a place. This quotation is another quote that highlights the brutal effects of conflict on a place. So the quotations we've looked at so far are very much quotations that you would use in a conflict essay. The next quotation is, "He has a job to do. Solutions slopping trays beneath his hands, which did not tremble then, though seem to now." I love this stanza. I think it's the best stanzas in the poem. And this quotation is one you would use with a power question. So the other two have been really about conflict. This one is the power of memory, which obviously then links to kamikaze. particularly from the poems we've done so far, but many other poems in the cluster as well, also the Emigre, which we've looked at so far as well. But he has a job to do, so he should stop in trace beneath his hand, which did not tremble then, does seem to now. When he's there, in the conflict zone, in a place like this background picture, when he's there, he's focused, suggesting he doesn't let the things, this is the character of the war photographer, the character of the war photographer doesn't let the brutalities around him affect him, because he stays in a zone and focused on the job at hand, because he obviously thinks that's the right and important thing to do, to take the pictures in order to make the rest of the world aware how horrific these conflict zones are. But when he goes home, that's when his hands tremble. So that tells us that when he goes home and he has time to reflect and he sees the pictures developing, he's haunted by the things he's seen. I mean, as he would be. So if you've been in a conflict zone and you've seen people dying, you've seen horrific injuries, you've seen explosions, you've seen children left without parents, those things would haunt you, they would traumatise you, and that's what's happened to the photographer. This is really interesting because it suggests that the actual experience of conflict in some cases isn't as bad as the after effects, the trauma, the mental trauma of the memories that you'll have if you've visited a conflict zone. So it suggests that the memories of conflict and brutality are often worse than the experience itself, and this poem very much links to Remains in that way, which is next, no it's not next week, it's the poem in a couple of weeks. So that quotation shows that the memory of the conflict zones for the war photographer is actually worse than the experience itself, because when he's there he detaches himself from the things that he's seeing so he can get on with his job, whereas when he goes home he's forced to reflect on the horrors of war and conflict. This is the full stanza really, but I've put the full thing in. So something's happening. A stranger's features faintly start to twist before his eyes. A half-formed ghost. He remembers the cries of this man's wife, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, and how the blood stained into foreign dust. There's loads going on here. There's something that's happening is the image developing. And the image is of a stranger, a person who has to live in one of these conflict zones. And it says, a stranger's features start to twist before his eyes, a half-formed ghost. And there's layers of interpretation here. I'll start with the first one. So, a stranger's features start to twist, and the half-formed ghost. This could link to the picture being faded as it develops, because when a picture develops, it initially starts as really faded and then it becomes more and more clear as it develops. So it could literally refer to the image developing. But a more interesting interpretation is the idea of the stranger's features twisting could link to pain. So it could link to how the image is a picture of a man or a stranger who is suffering and enduring pain due to being in a conflict zone. Similar to a half-formed ghost, half-formed could link literally to the picture not being fully developed, but more interestingly, half-formed could suggest that the man has been mutilated in some way. So again, this is another quotation that links to the horrific effects of conflict, the brutal effects of conflict. This bit here, how he sought approval without words to do what someone must, refers to the war photographer taking the photo. He feels like he has to do that job. He's got no choice. So he obviously is motivated by the fact he thinks the job is very important. This is the final quotation that I've included. So I think I like this stanza best actually. The reader's eyeballs prick with tears between the bath and pre-lunch beers. So bath and pre-lunch beers are both luxuries. The word prick is really important because it suggests that people aren't that deeply affected by the horrific images of war that they see. So they become distracted by the luxuries they have in their life. And that refers to people like us in England. It says we see these pictures, we might feel a moment of fleeting empathy, but that's it. we then distract ourselves with the advantages we have in our lives and turn ourselves off from caring. And you get the impression at the end of the poem that the war photographer feels hopeless and despondent. He stares in passively and he says they do not care, and that refers to us. It feels like we look at the images and they have no effect on us. So he starts to sort of question his job by the end. At the beginning he's really focused and he thinks that he can have an impact. By the end he's questioning whether there's any point, whether any of us in places that aren't affected by conflict actually care at all. I'm going to look at some methods now. Those were just the intentions. So the language methods. Now this is holophrasis. Oh, I can never say this. Holophrasis or holophrasis is used to sum each place, and it makes them out as though they're just nothing more than war zones. Like we hear Belfast and we just think conflict. So it's almost highlighting how when a place is affected by conflict, it becomes defined by conflict. So it's another good method that shows the effect of conflict on a place. Once a place is affected by conflict, it's almost just written off as a conflict zone and people detach themselves from it. The fact it's a list is also interesting because it suggests that it can be added to, which just links to the number of places around the world that are affected by conflict, again highlighting the reality of conflict in modern society. There's so much of it. The next language method is a simile, as though this were a church and he a priest preparing to intone a mass. Now, the fact he refers to himself as the fact Caroline Duffy refers to this photographer as a priest at the beginning draws attention to the importance of the role, but it also suggests how the war photographer's job is to deal with death, like a priest. Priests obviously do funerals, so it could link to that, and how his job is to pay respect to the dead. By taking these photos, he's keeping the memory of these people who lose their lives in the conflict zone alive. Without the photographs, actually, probably these people would just be totally forgotten. They'd just be a faceless victim of conflict. So like a priest, a war photographer is able to keep the memory of people who die in a conflict zone alive through images. The next one we've looked at a bit already, but it's the verb tremble. I think it's dead important. This is the main one I would analyse if I was doing a power question. It literally means to shake or quiver. Now, he isn't trembling at the beginning when he's in the war zone itself, which suggests he's sturdy, which suggests he's focused, and which suggests he's unaffected really by the things that he's seeing. However, the fact that the tremble, when he sees the pictures and the memories flood back, shows that he becomes shaken, nervous, distressed, maybe even ill. We associate shaken with illness. It shows that the memories of what he's seen have a powerful effect on him to the extreme that they have a physical effect on him. So it really shows the power of memory in that quote, and how actually the memories of conflict are often worse than the experience itself. Form and structure methods, again, like I've said before, you always need to try and talk about form and structure as well as language. We've got the caesura, and he has a job to do, solution, stopping trays. So this is the first line, it's split in two by the use of a full stop. See there? And it links to his matter of fact tone. He has a job to do. Solution, stopping trays. So that first sentence, he has a job to do, is really blunt, and it suggests that's all he's focused on while he's there. So that links to how when he's there in the war zone, he's detached from the horrors that he's seeing, again reinforcing that it's actually the memories of the conflict zone that have a more profound effect on him. Then we've got the juxtaposition. I love this one as a method. I think this is dead good to look at, particularly for the effects of conflict and to criticise those who are living in non-conflict zones and they're indifferent. It's a really good one for that. Rural England, home again to ordinary pain, which simple weather can dispel. That links to first world problems basically. We complain about the weather. We'll complain about the fact it's raining when children are terrified to leave the house because there could be a landmine. So it's just the absolute contrast of what it's like to live in a non-conflict zone like Britain compared to living somewhere affected by conflict. And I think that really brings home the reality of conflict, a really good quotation for highlighting what it's like to live in a conflict zone. You wouldn't be bothered about sort of trivial issues like the weather, because you could go out of your house and be blown up by a landmine. So it's just highlighting the different lives people live based on where they're born. It makes us feel guilty almost that we would even complain about the weather when other people are going through such suffering. But it just draws attention to kind of our lack of empathy for people in these zones. We switch ourselves off and focus on our own problems when there's much worse things happening in the world. It just makes it seem so unfair and so tragic that some people have the luxury of complaining about the weather when others have got to worry about whether they'll survive by leaving the house. And then, like in many of the poems, there's a lot of enjambment, which is where we've got the run on line. And there's loads of it in this poem. So sometimes the enjambment is a contrast from one line to the next. The enjambment in this poem, I think, shows how quickly the readers of the newspaper supplement it could be to reflect how quickly they skim over the newspaper. Like, we see and are exposed to what's happening in other countries all the time, but we almost don't take it in. We don't internalise it. We just skim over it, feel a little bit of empathy, maybe have a prick of a tear, and distract ourselves with the luxuries we have in Britain. So again, it's criticising the indifference to conflict that exists in places like Britain. We don't really care. I mean, we can see the stuff and feel really upset at the time, but they will generally distract ourselves. And in many ways, what can we do? But we could potentially do more, which is what's being explored in this poem. We are pretty indifferent to the horrors that are going on right now in the world, and that's being criticised there. And that is all. I hope that's helpful.